You know, the more we learn about the experiences of men, especially in relation to the data that we produce when we ask new questions, the more we find out we've been lied to. Straight up. We've been lied to about men. What's up, y'all? Hope all of you are well. Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. I am on my last day of grading, so I am almost done. So bear with me. I apologize about how long it's taken to start making regular content again. Nevertheless, wanted to jump into something. This was sent to me recently. I wanted to kind of cover it because I thought it important. And it really has to do with what we think we know about intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide. Although today's show is more about intimate partner violence, my last live dealt more so with the ways in which, when it comes to intimate partner homicide, between chivalry and our kind of gynofocal introduction to intimate partner homicide, we have very little remorse or empathy for men on the receiving end. And I showed some of the data around that. Now, I want to say what I'm going to talk about today is somewhat connected in regard to the data. I'm going to explain the difference in the numbers and what I think is coming. But let's kind of get on the same page here. So this is coming from a piece that I think you'll find interesting. You can find this on medicalexpress.com. It is entitled, it's dated December 16th, 2021, and titled Comparison of Intimate Partner Violence Injuries Among Sexes Uncovers Higher Level of Severity for Male Victims. All right? Yeah, higher level of severity. All right? So let's go in. It reads, intimate partner violence remains severely underreported in emergency departments, and women represent most reported cases. Now that's important. We talk about reported cases. We're not talking about how often it happens. We're talking about those who file. Right. And we also have to understand when we started to see the origins, particularly in the United States, of kind of the media introduction to abuse and even intimate partner homicide, we were primarily introduced to it from the vein of female victimization. So males were the aggressors, females were the recipients, if you will, the victims. And that was the primary narrative we were given. The way that's impacted generations of us later is that neither men or women are readily prepared to identify male victimization as abuse or as a result of abuse. We're less inclined to do so. And I think the numbers are affected because when we're less inclined to do so, when we're less capable of classifying it, even those who are suffering from it, then it stands to reason there will be fewer reports filed, right? So you have, as it says in the first sentence, women represent most reported cases. Let's continue. Few studies have evaluated how men present with IPV injuries, leaving emergency department physicians unprepared to identify and assist male victims of domestic violence. Right. Shout out to Dr. Tommy J. Curry. His work in The Man Not Dealing with the Duluth Model also shows the way professionals are trained, again, from a gynofocal lens, to primarily view women as victims of men, and to misinterpret or completely ignore, in some respects, male victimization as not being not, I don't want to say not being relevant altogether, but really not being part of the discourse on intimate partner violence. We're less inclined to see it that way. So that means victims are less inclined to see it that way. Those who are in the periphery looking in on a situation are less inclined to see it that way. But even trained professionals, physicians or social scientists, or excuse me, not social scientists, but social services are less inclined to see it this way because that's not how any of us are really trained, right? So it continues. New research led by investigators from Brigham and Women's Hospital uncovered distinct differences in how men and women experience IPV, outlining key injury trends for ED physicians to recognize. The results are published in Aggressive Behavior. It says, our findings are contrary to the general notion that violence perpetuated by women is not capable of causing severe injuries to their partners, said Bharti Khurana, MD, emergency radiologist and founding director of the Trauma Imaging Research and Innovation Center in Brigham's Department of Radiology. Moreover, men are less likely to seek help as they are less likely to recognize it as criminal, may see IPV as unmasculine and fear being ridiculed. Now, this is the popular narrative, particularly coming from feminists, about why men don't report. It's because they're too macho, right? And that's a comfortable assumption, when you come from a prevailing, kind of philosophical base that men are guided by patriarchal desires to control and dominate others. And it's really a sly way of, kind of dismissing and deflecting from the vulnerability of men. But in reality, much of it has to do with how many of us have been socialized, and we're talking about on a macro level, to interpret male victimization and male pain. For the most part, we don't identify male pain well, be it emotional, psychological, or physical. We tend to deflect when it comes to male pain. We use excuses, we use our kind of shorthand media training, but at the end of the day, we don't really fully grasp male pain. Not even men themselves, right? So, hold on. That part where she says they are less likely to seek help, that's real talk. That's real talk. It continues. Although roughly 33% of men experience IPV in their lifetimes, few efforts exist to recognize men facing this threat. Biases suggesting that IPV predominantly affects women may also cause medical professionals to overlook IPV-related injuries in male patients. While 35.1% of men in a previous study reported an injury severe enough for hospitalization, only 18.1% sought medical assistance, suggesting social stigmas may also dissuade men from seeking help. Now, that is a key point to remember. 35.1% of men in a previous study reported an injury severe enough for hospitalization, right? So that means that whether male or female, you may go to the hospital with injuries, caused by IPV. But to be hospitalized is a whole different level. To be admitted is a whole different level. And it's suggesting that more men tend to be admitted than women based on the severity of the injuries, right? But again, based on how we're socialized, whether you're talking about whether you're a young man talking about abuse from one's mother, grandmother, aunt, babysitter, or whether you're a husband or a boyfriend talking about a significant other or a wife, we're less inclined to send mommy to jail. We're less inclined to send wives, girlfriends, significant others to jail, knowing that is the fact. See, we often hear about this. We often hear about this when we hear about women who don't want to send husbands or boyfriends to jail, right? And it's presented as this kind of dedication to men, this lovelorn, sacrificial dedication that is seldom reciprocated properly, which ends up becoming another form of abuse that men, extend to women because you have all this undue loyalty and she doesn't want to report him. But the reality is, it's a human gesture, and it happens on both sides of the gender aisle. Men are no less, they're no more inclined to send women to jail than vice versa. As a matter of fact, I would argue they're even less so inclined, not just because they're too macho too, but also because we don't even think about women as aggressors. We don't know how to process that, and neither does the society. So how does that affect a situation that becomes criminal? Well, how do you think juries would assess this if it had to go to court? How inclined are they to see women as aggressors? Well, based on the sentencing practices we know about, at least pre-COVID, we know that when it comes to men and women committing the same crime, women get 65% less sentencing than men for the same crimes. So put that into the context of the mother of the family or the wife wife of the family who has committed an act of abuse against her husband. And it goes to court. Are juries more likely to see him as vulnerable? I'm not saying they have to or that they don't have to, but I'm saying that I don't think it's going to happen. Right? I don't think it's going to happen. So this is incredibly important because what we're looking at here is the impact of how we're sociologically trained to read human behavior primarily from one vantage point while we disregard another in regard to men. So let's continue here. Right. In this study, investigators collected data from the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System, a collection of injury data from roughly 100 hospitals across the country. Karana and colleagues compiled data from patients that self-reported IPV-related injuries from 2005 to 2015, then evaluated the cause of each injury, its anatomical location, and its diagnosis. They then compared these results between men and women. Now, when I looked at this website, it seemed to be based in the UK, and they don't specify in this article which they're referring to. So I can only assume that this data may pertain to the UK, but it is still nevertheless important. This research revealed significant sex differences in injury presentation and location. While facial bruises are common among female victims of IPV, men in this study were significantly more likely to have lacerations, most often on their forearms. Means those are defensive wounds, right? We use the forearms to protect our vital areas, right? Men were also more likely to have been cut or pierced, bitten, hit by a motor vehicle, burned, or sustained a gunshot wound, while women were more likely to have been struck or fallen. In other words, and I've been saying this for years, women tend to use weapons and other kind of devices, vehicles, so on and so forth. Men tend to use their own hands or their own body, so to speak. These are fairly consistent tropes when it comes to IPV in regard to men and women. There were also more hospitalizations in IPV male victimizations than female. Interestingly, men constituted 36.1% of all IPV victims over 60, raising awareness that IPV considerably impacts older men. This too is important because another trope of female aggression in regard to domestic violence is that women tend to be more aggressive and abusive, especially to those who are more vulnerable. So whether you're talking about little kids or whether you're talking about elderly men, you find that the abuse rates tend to go up. Now, the abuses, we've talked about this over the last year and a half, especially when it comes to IPV in general. Women tend to abuse more often, they tend to initiate conflict, and they tend to use weapons more often. And I think part of this is because society does not regard them to be the primary or relevant aggressors in the dynamic. So women are not trained to see themselves as potentially dangerous. Society is not trained to hold them accountable for such, and men aren't even trained to interpret it as such. So women kind of have a free pass to be violent. And when they're responded to, or if they're hurt, even if the male initiates it, if she's more likely to report it because she's been socialized to identify being struck or even emotionally abused, she's been socialized to identify that as a various type of abuse. Most men aren't. Whether it's psychological, emotional, physical, doesn't matter, financial, men generally don't interpret their experience in regard to that. This is something I remember even from my youth. I remember even older men, when the issue rarely would come up. Well, I shouldn't say rarely. But when the issue came up of female aggression, physicality, so on and so forth, the older men would just tell you that's just how women are. I never once heard them use the word abuse. Now this is the flip though. If you have a younger woman asking elder women about abuse, or coming to them with a situation where she's been touched, physically assaulted by a significant other, those women will readily not only tell her it's abuse, they will also go into great depth about what she should do about that abuse. The availability of options that she has access to. But when young men ask older men about their experiences, that's just how women are. You should have done this. You should have done that. Hell, even on social media, most men will be the first to tell a male victim, hey man, you should have chose better, player. So should have chose a better woman. We have these kind of deflective ways of dealing with it, but we won't identify what it actually is, especially in the eye of the law. Right? So anyway, let's continue. Notably, this study only included participants that disclosed that they were victims of IPV at the time of injury. That's important, right? That means they have to first be able to identify it as such, then they have to be willing to do it, and then they have to be willing, then they actually do it. They have to actually say, I am a victim of IPV. So you got 3 stages just in that. 4 if you count even going to a medical professional in response to your wounds in the first place, right? So going is 1. Acknowledging that what you experience, or being able to classify it as abuse, being able to recognize the situation for what it is and interpret it as such, being willing, right, to come forward and actually say something, and then actually doing it. Those four things need to happen for somebody to file and report. And again, if you've not been socialized to do it, it may not even cross your mind as something that you should consider doing. And I think those things do contribute. Now, here's another piece to it. We know in 2013, the FBI redefined its definition of rape to not so much, kind of depend on the traditional narrative that they've been using since the early 20th century, where a woman being violated was pretty much it. Sexually violated, that was it. The carnal knowledge of a woman, that was the extent to the definition. Now, they began to use a definition that wasn't gender-based. And once they did so, they started getting flooded with reports of male victimization. So it's not that it's never happened before, but it is that it's only recently been discovered to occur because the definitions have started to change. The definitions of intimate partner violence, intimate partner homicide, and sexual assault and rape, all of these definitions are opening up the discourse when we go to a non-gendered definition of violation and victimization. And when that happens, we start to find that there's way more happening under the sun. It's like, remember I used to tell my son years ago that seeing is not believing. Believing is seeing. And when it comes to research, what that basically means is until you ask the right research questions, the data, even producing the data, even producing the studies for it are hard to come by. You have to actually first ask the question. Right? So if you say, well, seeing is believing, that means I see a woman with a black eye, ergo abuse happens primarily to women, that's one thing. But when you say believing is seeing, it means you have to first go in and say, okay, I wonder how many men are victims of this. And then you start to see the responses. Especially if you change the definitions and you open up the definitions to male victims, then you start to see a deluge of men and boys coming forward. And that's what they've started to find in recent years. And that's why the title of this video has to do with what is changing. Because as those definitions change, as men are socialized to identify their experiences and come forward, and it's a slow socialization process, not happening as quickly as it did with women. But as we do, we're already seeing the rates of abuse, especially in the Black community, are bidirectional, meaning they're almost equal. And we haven't even had a massive socialization program to change how we identify situations. And it's already happening. Already we're starting to see it. So this is, I think what we're going to see is that there are far more issues that are fairly equal, if not tipped, to men's detriment to a greater degree. Once we start to ask questions that are not gender biased to prioritize women and girls. And the more we start to prioritize men and boys by either degendering definitions or actively including the tropes of how men are victims. See, that's one of the things this article does. It doesn't just stop at saying, well, we think men are victims too. It actually goes further and says these are the specific types of injuries that men tend to sustain more often than women. Women tend to be abused, particularly on the face or in regard to bruises, welts, so on and so forth, black eyes. Men, lacerations, they tend to be cut, pierced, bitten, hit by motor vehicles, burned, or shot. And when you start to see those definitions more specific to men's experience, you open up the doors for men to finally report. And when we start to get more and more of that data, it changes what we thought we knew. And that more and more of that is happening. So let me get to the last of this, right? So victims of domestic violence rarely reveal the origins of their injuries and ED, meaning that many IPV cases go undetected. In the future, Karana hopes to incorporate this research into medical training and has already begun educating the radiology community and instructing her residents on what to look for in patient injuries. Now, this is key. One doctor is training her staff to recognize and identify specific types of injuries to a specific demographic. That's how the culture is changed. That's how new research data is produced. But until those things happen, then you'll continue to get these little pamphlets that suggest that abuse is one way, right? I mean, I remember even in academic documentaries in the last decade, I've seen data on the screen, at showings at the university where students would come in and take notes, ordered by their class to come in and watch the documentary, and it would say things like 99% of abuse is male on female, or rape for that matter. And they were comfortable in saying it because, again, the culture had not changed. The environment had not changed. The parameters to produce new studies, develop new ways of interpreting and defining phenomena, and then creating new studies based on those new definitions, none of those things had happened yet. So they were comfortable making these grandiose statements about abuse and victimization. So Khurana continues. What we're seeing is still the tip of the iceberg, as very few patients will report IPV at the time of injury. Identifying these injuries would allow us to provide patients with resources. This is incredibly important because it speaks to a shift, a slow shift that's happening. But the reason that it's slow is you have a lot of people that don't want to give up ground. What do I mean? Well, this stuff is political. When you start talking about abuse, IPV, IPH, now you're not just talking about what people experience. You're then talking about who gets funding, who gets shelters made, who gets laws made, and in what interest and whose interest, what policies are created, which politicians will produce them and get votes to do so. See, all this becomes political. So once you change the definitions and then the data begins to change, well, then the policies have to change at some point, especially as you develop more and more activists who are willing to take this new information and say, wait a minute, we are wrong about how we've been told to interpret this. But that tends to not happen until you have new data. I mean, even if you look at the last 20, 30 years of activism in the Black community, a lot of it now is based on intersectionality. Well, yeah, but intersectionality comes out of something that was really put on the docket, so to speak, in the late 1980s, Kimberly Crenshaw. Once she put it out there, believing is seeing. Then it became something that students were taught. And after a couple generations, that became the primary mode for interpreting activism, right? Who's most victimized, who should be advocated for, right? Believing is seeing. First, it took the concept, then it reached fruition. That's what we're seeing now. We're starting to see what I think will be a sea change in what the data will produce because we're asking new questions. Not that this is a new phenomena. It's not that men have never been abused before. It's that we never asked the question, or we didn't do so seriously. I'll give you another example. A number of years ago, I was asked to give a presentation to a suicide hotline. And I was supposed to train their operators and give a presentation on male victimization. Suffice it to say, they quickly did not ask me ever to do that again. They came to the university and I gave a presentation on the campus of Fresno State. And it wasn't that the presentation was ill, given, poorly done, poorly researched. No, not at all. I had stats, I had data, I had, everything was cited, provided all of the sources for everything I covered. And I went into depth about male victimization and in particular, Black male victimization. The reason why they never came back is because, first of all, the managers as well as the actual operators were overwhelmingly female. And what they had been taught, much like what Dr. Tommy Curry talks about when he deals with the Duluth model in The Man Not, they were trained with a gynofocal kind of framework for how to interpret things, which basically, was fairly rooted in the Duluth model in actuality, right? Where females are victimized by males, men benefit from patriarchy, and therefore all kinds of abuse are really a product of patriarchy, which is code for men are always at fault. But when I actually began to present the amount of data, even up to at the time, this might have been 6-7 years ago, if not 8, the data I had even then about female aggression, about male victimization, it made them extremely uncomfortable to the extent that they weren't even willing to look at the citations. Because for them, it was a much more comfortable idea to believe that all women were oppressed by all men. And therefore, when you have this comfortable Manichaean, bad, good, light, dark, framework, you can go out and fight, for the rights of, But when that worldview was threatened, they didn't know how to respond. And so their response was never to call me back in. But more than me, it's not really about me. They also didn't go to any other scholars about male victimization, especially scholars who are primarily focused on the experiences of men and boys. They resisted that entirely. Because again, not only was it a threat to their worldview, but might actually eventually become a threat to their funding when you start to talk about males as victims. Even to this day, the idea that intimate partner violence is bidirectional, especially in the Black community, nobody wants to deal with that. Because if you say long enough that abuse is equal from men to women and women to men, it disrupts what we thought. It disrupts what we've been trained to believe. And at some point, it would have to disrupt how we administer resources to resolve the issue. Now you just can't have, 99 for every 100 shelters being primarily for women. And that's actually way too generous. You might have 1, maybe 2 shelters in the entire country if they're still open. But part of the problem with that is not only funding, but also having men understand that they've been victims of this dynamic as well. Not how we're trained. So anyway, wanted to get that across. I hope it provides you with some food for thought. I hope it's something you can share. You're a graduate student, college student, something you can include in the paper. I will put the link to the article in the description for the video. And other than that, peace. Yeah.